Ever get that feeling like you really want to understand something deeply, something important, but you don't want to have to wade through like a ton of information to get there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've all been there.
Well, that's what we're doing today. We are going to deep dive into a topic that at first glance might seem kind of old-fashioned, maybe even a little bit, irrelevant. We're going to be talking about sin.
Sin, right. But before you totally tune us out thinking we've gone all fire and brimstone on you, I think you'll be surprised by the direction this goes. We're not looking at this through a strictly religious lens. We're going to explore a really fascinating and I think really relevant perspective on sin and how it relates to the progress and well-being of society.
Exactly. And to guide us on this deep dive, we are going to be using a discourse given by Shrii P.R.Sarkar way back in 1970.
1970. Okay, so this is going way back.
Yeah. It's from over half a century ago. But his insights, I think you'll agree, are incredibly fresh and offer a really optimistic and, dare I say, progressive way of thinking about, building a better future together.
I like it. So what exactly is our mission today?
Well, we are going to unpack Sarkar's 3 key causes of sin. And I'm putting that in air quotes because, well, he's not talking about sin in the traditional religious sense. He's talking about actions and conditions that actively hold back positive evolution, the progress of our entire world.
Interesting. Okay, so how does he even begin to define sin in that kind of context?
Right. Well, that's where it gets super interesting. Right off the bat, Sarkar makes this crucial distinction, one that sort of sets the stage for his whole argument. He points out that we, as a society, we often kind of mix up sin with crime.
Okay, right. So sin being a violation of, I guess, spiritual or religious codes.
Yeah.
And crime being the breaking of actual laws.
Precisely. And Sarkar is actually pretty critical of defining sin only by religious dogma.
Makes sense. So much changes over time.
Exactly. So his point is that really wise people should, they should evaluate any set of rules, whether it's religious or whatever, based on fundamental human values.
Right. Things that promote well-being for everyone, kindness, fairness, treating people right, those kinds of core values.
Exactly. And to really emphasize that idea, he brings in this really powerful perspective from Vyasa.
Vyasa. Now, remind me, who was that again?
Oh, he was the sage who compiled the ancient Puranas. And Vyasa said, and this is really key here, he said, that action which checks the progress of the society is sin, and that action which accelerates social progress is punya or virtue.
Okay, so right there, that's a pretty profound shift in how we usually think about sin, isn't it? Moving away from, individual transgressions against some divine law and more towards the actual tangible consequences of actions on society.
Exactly. So for our deep dive today, that's going to be our working definition. Sin is anything that slams on the brakes of social progress.
All right, I like it. Really makes you think. So I'm guessing Sarkar doesn't stop there. He probably has some thoughts on what those societal breaks actually are.
Oh, absolutely. But before we get into that, he does have one more really interesting point to make about our legal systems.
Okay, so this is about crime, right?
Exactly. So remember, crime is defined by laws. But he points out that those laws, they're not always perfect. Laws are made by people, by politicians, and they don't always perfectly align with those, universal human values.
Which is why I bet he probably says that following every single law blindly might not always be the right thing to do.
You know him so well. That's exactly what he says. He really emphasizes that putting those cardinal human values first, the ones that promote well-being for everyone, that promote real progress, he says those are most important.
All right, that makes sense. But so, how does all of this relate back to this idea of sin? The actions that hold society back. I mean, we've got this definition from Vyasa, but what does Sarkar say about the specific actions that we should be really paying attention to?
Okay, well, to answer that, we got to look at the causes of sin. And that's what he gets into next. He identifies 3 major factors that, that can kind of lead society down this path, down this road of holding ourselves back from progress.
Okay, 3 causes of sin, as defined by hindering social progress. I'm interested. Lay 'em on me. What's the first one?
All right. So the first cause he points out is this shortage of physical and psychic pabulum.
Pabulum. Okay, now that's a word you don't hear every day. What does that even mean?
It sounds a little old-fashioned, right? But basically, he's just talking about essential nourishment. Not just, the physical things we all need, like food and shelter and all that, but also intellectual nourishment, things that help us grow, learn, and understand the world around us.
So the basic stuff like food and shelter, and then the intellectual stuff like education and access to information. Okay, got it. But how does that relate to this idea of sin, of holding society back?
Well, his point is that when people are struggling to meet their basic needs, it can cloud their judgment. It can make it harder for them to act wisely and with compassion. He uses this example of even a brilliant person, a really intelligent person. If they're super angry or stressed, they might say really foolish or even hurtful things.
Yeah, I think we've all been there. Sometimes when you're just, really struggling or under a lot of pressure, it's hard to think straight.
Exactly. And he takes that same idea and applies it to our intellectual needs, to our mental well-being. He says that if people aren't getting enough intellectual stimulation, if they lack education, if they don't have access to accurate information, well, they can easily mistake really harmful ideas for good ones.
Oh, that's a good point. And, that can apply to so many things, right? From, believing in conspiracy theories to falling for political propaganda.
Absolutely. And he gives a really, a pretty striking example. He talks about communal riots where people can be manipulated by, these really misguided leaders. He calls them political satans and political pigs.
Wow. He doesn't hold back, does he?
Nope. But, it makes sense. When people aren't well informed, when they don't really understand, what's going on in the world around them, they're much more vulnerable to manipulation and to acting in ways that are, harmful to themselves and to everyone else.
So essentially, this first cause is about a kind of poverty, right? Both a lack of essential material things and a lack of essential knowledge.
Exactly. And he brings it right back to that definition of sin. He says that when those essential resources are missing, both physical and intellectual, people can end up, they can end up acting in ways that are, almost primal. They might break the law, of course, but they're also going against that deeper idea of social progress.
Okay, so for example, if someone steals food because they're desperate to feed their family, or if violence breaks out because people are afraid and misinformed about something.
Yeah, those are perfect examples. And the important thing to remember, he says, is that this isn't just a problem in, developing countries or whatever.
Right. Even in richer countries, people can experience this kind of poverty, right?
Exactly. Even in places with, a higher average income, you can still have this shortage of essential resources. It might be less obvious, but it's still there. It might be a lack of access to good education for everyone, or not enough support for mental health, or even the spread of all this misinformation online. All of that can contribute to this kind of, societal poverty and ultimately lead to actions that really harm society.
Okay, so that's cause number one, not having enough. What's the next one?
Okay, so the second cause he talks about is almost the opposite. It's the non-utilization of overaccumulated physical and psychic pabulum.
Okay, so now we're talking about having too much, not too little.
Exactly. It's the problem of having more than enough resources, more than enough knowledge, but not using it in a way that actually benefits everyone.
Interesting. So what's Sarkar's take on why that happens? Why do people hoard resources instead of sharing them?
Well, he uses this really interesting analogy. He talks about a mango grove. Imagine someone owns this huge mango grove and has tons of delicious mangoes, way more than they could ever eat. But instead of sharing those mangoes, letting other people enjoy them, they just let them rot on the ground.
That sounds pretty wasteful.
Exactly. And that's his point. He says human needs are, at their core, they're pretty limited. We only need so much food, so much shelter, And when we accumulate way beyond that, way beyond what we actually need, and then don't use it for good, it creates a whole bunch of problems.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just about greed then. It's about not putting those excess resources to good use.
Exactly. And he says this non-utilization often leads to misutilization. So people with a lot of wealth, or a ton of untapped intellectual capacity, they might end up indulging in what he calls baser propensities.
Baser propensities. Now, what does that mean exactly?
Well, he's talking about all those sort of selfish desires, harmful behaviors, things that don't actually do any good in the world. It's like instead of using their wealth and knowledge to, make a positive impact, they just kind of squander it on things that ultimately don't matter.
Okay, so they're not necessarily actively trying to harm anyone. They're just sort of, wasting their potential.
Right.
And ultimately, that waste ends up harming society.
You got it. And to illustrate this, he brings in some examples. He talks about, historically, kings and nawabs, those who lived in extreme luxury, often became really detached from the needs of their people.
Okay, so that classic image of the out-of-touch ruler living in a palace while the people are struggling.
Exactly. And he says, in modern times, we see that same thing with aristocrats or super wealthy people who have nothing meaningful to do. He says that kind of idle existence can lead them to become, wicked and mean-minded.
Wow. So even if they're not actively exploiting people, the fact that they're not using their wealth and their influence to actually do some good, that in itself is a form of, sin, according to this definition.
Exactly. And he doesn't just limit this to, like, the super rich. He also mentions, government officials who lack psychic and spiritual interests.
What does he mean by that?
Well, he's suggesting that those kinds of people without any, intellectual curiosity or spiritual depth might be more likely to, misuse their power, maybe become corrupt.
Oh, I see. So again, it's not just about the material stuff, but also about the way we use our minds and our hearts.
You got it. And what's really striking is how he connects this whole issue of overaccumulation to the suffering of those who don't have enough. He argues that the greed and non-utilization by the haves directly leads to the exploitation of the have-nots. And it leads to their sin, too.
Oh, that's a really important point. He's saying that these things are all interconnected.
Absolutely. He paints this really vivid image of, big capitalists thriving while half-naked children are working in their factories.
Yeah, that image really drives home the point.
Yeah.
So essentially, this second cause of sin is like the flip side of the first. It's not about scarcity, it's about abundance, but an abundance that's misused and ultimately leads to harm.
Precisely. And he doesn't just focus on these extreme examples. He also looks at countries with a relatively high standard of living, places where most people have their basic needs met.
But he's saying even in those places, there can still be a problem with this non-utilization of resources.
Exactly. He says that even in those more affluent societies, when some people are hoarding a lot of wealth, it can create a sense of meaninglessness, lack of purpose for everyone else. And he says this can contribute to all sorts of problems, things like suicide or addiction, or even just this kind of social parasitism.
Social parasitism, what does that mean?
He's talking about people who, they just aren't really contributing to society. They might be able to, they might have the resources to, but they just don't feel the need to. They're not really pulling their weight, so to speak.
Yeah, I could see how that could be a real issue. So essentially, he's arguing that even in wealthy societies, there's a moral imperative to use resources wisely and to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to contribute and find meaning in their lives.
Exactly. All right, so we've covered the first two causes. Ready for the third?
Hit me with it.
Okay, so this one is all about the importance of movement and dynamism, both in our minds and in our actions. It's stagnancy in the psychic and physical strata.
Okay, stagnancy. So we're talking about being stuck.
Exactly. He starts by reminding us that while, the world is constantly in motion, things are always changing around us, our thoughts are always flowing, the real progress, the real positive change, he says, happens on a spiritual level.
Okay, so there's movement in the physical world and there's movement in our thoughts. But true progress is about something deeper, something spiritual.
Exactly. But, he says, even though that true progress is spiritual, having movement and dynamism in our physical actions and in our thoughts, that's still super important.
Important for what?
For avoiding decline, for avoiding stagnation. He uses this really great analogy here. He talks about the difference between a bull walking down a road, like actually going somewhere, and a bull that's stuck in a grinding mill, just walking around in circles.
Okay, so in both cases, the bull is moving. But in the first case, it's actually making progress, getting somewhere. In the second case, it's just, spinning its wheels.
Exactly, and that's what he's getting at. It's the difference between movement that leads to positive change and movement that just keeps us stuck in the same place. And this lack of meaningful movement, this stagnation in our thoughts and our actions and in our social systems, that's what he identifies as the third cause of sin.
And this can happen even when there isn't like an overaccumulation of resources, right?
Right, exactly. It's not just about having too much or not enough. It's about being stuck, being resistant to positive change.
Okay, I'm following. So what are some of the things that contribute to this kind of stagnation?
Well, he talks about clinging to old dogmas, those outdated beliefs that we refuse to let go of. And he also talks about, personal weaknesses, like things that we know we should work on, but we just We just don't. And of course, he talks about, a lack of good education that teaches people to think critically, to question things, to be open to new ideas. All of that can lead to, to this kind of mental laziness, this stagnation.
So essentially, it's about resisting growth and change.
Yeah.
And I guess his point is that this isn't just harmful to the individual, it also harms society as a whole, right?
Precisely. He says it can even impede the progress of those around us. He gives this example that we probably can all relate to. Like if someone insists on doing something a certain way just because that's how my ancestors did it, that kind of blind adherence to tradition. And he contrasts that with how society naturally evolves over time. Like he points out that even something as simple as clothing styles have changed drastically over the centuries. We don't just wear the same things our great-great-grandparents wore.
Right. We adapt and evolve.
Exactly. And he's really adamant about this point. He says that people should not be allowed to hide behind those outdated ancestral beliefs if they're actually blocking progress. He uses this image of a cart, like a cart that's stuck in the middle of the road, preventing anyone else from getting through.
Okay, so you got to move the cart, even if it takes a little force.
Exactly. And then he makes this really interesting observation. He suggests that people who hold on to these overly conservative viewpoints, the ones that are really resistant to change, he says they're often very materialistic and mentally stagnant. He even says they need a good dose of speed and acceleration in their thinking.
Okay, so we've got these three causes of sin, as Sarkar defines them: not having enough, having too much, and not using it well, and then this stagnation, this resistance to change and growth.
Exactly. But here's the best part. Sarkar doesn't just leave us with the problems. He offers solutions.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where that really optimistic and progressive tone of his work shines through.
I was hoping you'd say that. So what are some of the solutions he proposes?
Well, he brings back those Sadvipras that we talked about earlier, those spiritual revolutionaries. He sees them as playing this really critical role in, overcoming these societal obstacles.
Right. They're the ones who can help steer society towards a more progressive path.
Exactly. So for that first cause, the shortage of essential resources, his solution is pretty straightforward. He says we have to ensure everyone has access to those minimum physical and intellectual requirements. Everyone needs enough food, shelter, healthcare, education, all of that basic stuff.
Right. It's about meeting people's fundamental needs so they can thrive.
Exactly. And he really drives home this point about how interconnected we all are. He uses this image that if your neighbor's house is on fire, your house will also catch fire. We can't just ignore the suffering of others because it ultimately affects us all.
Yeah, it's like that saying, no one is free until everyone is free.
Exactly. And he says that achieving this, this equitable distribution of resources requires a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, you need a really strong and just administration, a government that ensures things are fair.
Right, to make sure those resources are actually getting to the people who need them.
Exactly. And then on the other hand, you need a kind of intellectual awakening. You need to empower people with knowledge and critical thinking skills so they can, advocate for themselves and make informed decisions.
So it's about both top-down and bottom-up change, right? You need good leadership and you need empowered citizens. And I guess this is where the Sadvipras come in, right?
Exactly. He believes they're the ones best equipped to provide that leadership to guide society in the right direction.
All right, so that's how he addresses the first cause.
Yeah.
What about the second one? What about that problem of overaccumulation, of having too much and not using it well?
Okay, well, for that one, he advocates for, he says we need an intellectual approach combined with a kind of active spreading of positive values.
So education is key here.
Definitely. Education is huge. He wants to cultivate a sense of social responsibility, the understanding that we're all in this together and that having a lot of wealth or resources comes with the responsibility to use it for good.
Right. It's not enough to just not be actively harmful. You have to actually be actively helpful.
Exactly. But, while he's a big believer in education and in appealing to people's better nature, he also recognizes that sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes, he says, you might need to use physical force.
Whoa, hold on. What does he mean by that?
Well, he's not talking about violence, really. He's just saying that, sometimes you might need some kind of intervention, some kind of, redistribution of resources to ensure that those excess resources are actually being used for the benefit of everyone.
Okay, so it's more like, I don't know, maybe progressive taxation or government regulation to ensure that wealth is being shared more equitably.
Exactly. And again, he emphasizes the role of the Sadvipras here. They're the ones who can, they can combine those intellectual and practical strategies that can be the teachers and the leaders and the change makers.
Okay, so that's 2 down. What about that third cause? What about stagnation? What's his solution for getting people unstuck?
Okay, well, when it comes to stagnation, he argues that a purely intellectual approach isn't always going to work, especially for those people who are, really entrenched in those outdated dogmas.
The ones who are really resistant to change.
Exactly. And he uses some pretty strong language here. He suggests that those people, those who refuse to learn and evolve, he says they're actually, he says they're neither human beings nor animals.
Wow. That's pretty harsh. Why does he say that?
Well, his point is that, both human beings and animals are capable of learning and adapting. But these stagnant individuals, they've kind of lost that capacity. They're stuck. And in their refusal to change, well, they're actually hindering the progress of everyone else.
Okay, so they're almost less than human in a way because they've lost that essential capacity for growth and change. And that's a big problem because it's holding everyone back.
Exactly. And his solution for this, it's equally strong. He says the Sadvipras need to, they need to strike these stagnant individuals with a hammer.
Strike them with a hammer. Now, is he talking literally here?
No. It's a metaphor.
Okay, good.
But it's, it's a pretty powerful image, right?
Definitely. So what does he mean by that metaphor?
He's saying that sometimes, you need to use a strong force to break through that rigid thinking. You need to shake people up, get them out of their comfort zones, and force them to confront new ideas.
So it's about shaking them out of their complacency and getting them to see things in a new way.
Exactly. He says the goal is to remove that unnatural resistance to progress. It's about setting humanity back on a path of positive evolution. And he ends this whole section with a really powerful call to action. He calls on all the Sadvipras of the world to be bold, to be decisive, and to actively work to dismantle all those obstacles that are holding back human advancement. It's a really inspiring message, full of hope for what we can achieve if we have the courage to embrace change and work together.
Wow. I'm really liking this guy's thinking.
Yeah.
It's so positive and forward-looking.
I know, right? And, he really does believe that by addressing those root causes of sin, the lack of resources, the misutilization of surplus, and that stagnation, humanity really can move towards a better future.
A future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Exactly. And he emphasizes that it's not some passive process. We all have an active role to play in creating that better future.
Right. It's about each of us taking responsibility for our own growth, challenging those outdated ways of thinking, and working to create a more just and equitable society.
You got it. And on that note, here's a really energizing thought to leave you with. Which of those causes of stagnation, whether it's resisting new ideas, clinging to comfort zones, or just a lack of intellectual curiosity, which of those is most present in the world today? And what kind of proactive strikes, not strikes of, negativity or violence, but strikes of innovation, open-mindedness, and positive action, what kind of strikes can we each take to clear a path for a more progressive future?
It's about embracing that dynamism, constantly striving for improvement, and working towards a world where everyone has the chance to thrive, where our collective abundance is used wisely, and where we are all constantly learning and moving forward together.
This has been a super inspiring deep dive into Sarkar's thinking. It's a reminder that creating a better world isn't just a dream, it's something we can all actively contribute to. Thanks so much for being on this journey with us.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Until next time.
See ya.